I would like to invite you to imagine that you are suddenly, right now, stricken totally and completely blind. Now, I believe it is more probable than not that that imagining you've just done, you got wrong. And that's a pretty bold assertion on my part, so let me explain why I made it and how I think that's relevant to the world I want to show you. So, first and foremost, I think that the transition trauma, the moment in which we engage in something different and change in our life, is incredibly difficult. And that moment, I would like to say and suggest, is the most powerful and challenging part of it. And the more time that we get, the more we learn to ease through that transition, if we choose to get to where we hope to go. And if we want to just live in that moment of transition trauma, we can be paralyzed and we can stay there for however long we choose without getting to a different world. Now, saying that, I want to try to show you that different world. And in my instance, I want to take you back just 2 short weeks ago when I stood on top of Mount Kilimanjaro as the sun rose on a new day for me. And as I was up there was this wonderful moment as the sun is coming up. It's a bright orange and yellow collection that formed on the rim of the crater, this violet horizon. And the brilliant glaciers to our right was almost overpowering visually. And the striations from the darkness into the blues of the coming of that sun was just so powerful. And being in that moment, I was given these descriptions, obviously by my teammates. To be able to receive the reward of living in that moment is a choice. And it's a choice I wouldn't have made when I first went blind. And if I had imagined, as I asked you to do, what it was going to be like going blind or what it was going to be like shortly after, I wouldn't have had that reality in mind. And the truth is, the spectacle and power of that moment is something that will stay with me. And for those of you sighted, maybe it will stay with you a little bit. And not only is the visual field overwhelmed, but we continued. We weren't quite at the summit. We continued counterclockwise around the Kaibo crater. And as we got a little bit further, and as the sun came up a little more, as a little more of the brand new day came upon us, our vision got to change a little. And in the description there, which I'd also like to show you, what was highlighted is that just a little more light brought more depth and detail to that crater. It brought more pronouncing of the glaciers next to us. It gave us a little more promise of what was around us. And all of that moment is captured for me because I chose to be there and because I surrounded myself with a team and a community that was willing to be there and share that. And that's an interesting power. And I like to think that the method of getting there is a method of learning to manipulate risks to allow ourselves to go forward from the paralysis of that initial moment, right? That initial moment of transition trauma. And in order to do that, you have to come up first with, where is my destination? Which way do I want to go? That's how you can start to evaluate. How am I going to get there? Why am I going to get there? And once you have that process, then you start in the positive directions. That's when it becomes easier. That's when my bold assertion that you've gotten it wrong starts to highlight for you as well. And that's true for any transition trauma, not just obviously blindness. Now, that said, I want to talk about how do we move forward into other types of risk management, since I say that's the key. And I like to think of it first as risk manipulation. I mean, we all take risks in our lives. Getting into a car is probably the most dangerous thing any of us will ever do, especially if I'm your driver. But I can mitigate that risk, right? Make sure my driver's had enough sleep, make sure they're not texting, all sorts of things that could affect that. And there's a second part of risk manipulation that is essential to my process, and I think essential for all of us. And it's the notion of social risk management. You see, for me, when I first went blind, there was a process. I had to learn how to use a blind cane, and I really didn't welcome and embrace that, because that cane to me, well, it was the tool that let me walk around safely. It also was the tool that highlighted to everybody the attention of my perception of being less, my perception of being disabled. And it was my scarlet letter that let me feel awful. And I had some vision at that point. I was only legally blind, not illegally blind as I am now. And in that perception, I could see people's reaction. I could see the fear, the pity, and sometimes worse, in negative emotions and how they responded, because it's a lack of understanding. And you know what? I had that same lack of understanding. And the key to working around that is education and experience. Now, my first experience, I learned how to use the cane. Then I learned how to use the limited vision I had to just scan, and I chose to hide from that cane. In fact, I took it, I broke it over my knee and threw it out. Now, that's okay, right? It is fair that in those early stages of loss and trauma that you might be angry, I was, you might be depressed, confused, you might even be in denial. And I had all of those things. The question again, as I asked earlier, how long did I want to stay there? And in throwing out my cane, I sort of was staying there because I was removing a tool that would aid me in getting around, and my notion for doing it was purely based on one point of focus, the focus of what was the risk management of how people would react to me. But there were many other risks I should have been considering and trying to manipulate. For instance, walking in a grocery store, as I walked down the aisle, scanning as best I could, a toddler stepped in front of me under my central field of vision. And my knee struck him, knocked him to the floor crying, and obviously, pretty traumatic for me. I've just hurt another individual. And obviously, his parents could have probably kept him in a little better. But they had no way to know. They didn't have the warning of my cane. And the child didn't have the chance of my cane finding him first as well. I let my choice, I let my vanity perhaps, whatever, the fear of that trauma, I let that restrict me, and it caused damage. Really good eye-opener for me, right, on how to put my focus on evaluating more of the risk. Because inaction, as well as action, has risks we need to assess and decide what is the right way to manage this. And learning through that process and getting more comfortable, I've gotten to get to some pretty fine points. For instance, you know, that description of the sunrise and the crater and the change, you probably didn't imagine that initially. I certainly didn't. But I've gone on beyond that. I've learned to believe, as some of our other TED Talkers have shared, in the power of possibility if you learn to take the right approach. And that's that, which way do I want to go? How do I get there? And sometimes it requires a little bit of a leap of faith. You know, for example, there's certainly a nice introduction there, but whether running marathons or climbing mountains or writing a book or founding a company, you have to start heading in that direction. You have to take that initial leap of believing it's possible and then evaluating how am I going to get to that point. And in my instance, I think powerfully I'm going to showcase that. I was out doing a Tough Mudder in March of this year out in LA. And you know, there's this marvelous moment where I'm standing on a 25-foot platform. And underneath me is water that you can jump into. But the goal is to jump 8 or 9 feet out, grab hold of a small little T-bar, which is the start of a trapeze that you're going to swing out across this water, leap into the air, ring a bell, and then fall 25 feet to the water. All while you can't see, of course. Now, people who can see, roughly 10% of them made it. Now, let's take a look at that clip, and then I'll talk about it.
Learning to look at the world differently is the key to really having vision, and vision is always going to be way more important than sight.
So the truth of that moment, I didn't believe I was going to ring that bell, right? What I believed is I was going to evaluate all of the things that were involved in it. So the first risk is, you know, what will happen if I fail? I'll fall to the water. So as long as I'm prepared for that and how to fall as well as possible, good. But I reached out with my blind cane as far as I could. One of my teammates actually held me to keep me from falling early. And I tapped the edge of that bar, and I pointed my toes in at it so I'd have an angle so that as I got my focus and my courage to jump out that far, that I had a direction for it. And then I went against convention, which I often believe. People try to jump out and grab that little bar. Well, I'm likely to miss that. That's too precise. But that big vertical bar, that's what I swung out to grab. Change convention, slide down. I had timed people that were doing their jump to know how long you'd be in the air, and I had that counter in my head. And I let go, and I said, you know, I don't know if I'm going to ring this bell. I'm just going to try as hard as I can. Because that's how you should pursue everything. Give your best, have solved all the problems you can reasonably solve, and understand all the real consequences of what can go wrong. If you do that, who knows what kind of accomplishments you can have in the world, right? That's what I believe, and that's what I work towards. Now, hearing the crowd chant your name is sort of a powerful point, but it also reminds me, back again to people, the power of people and teams and community and collaboration to allow all of us to lift ourselves up to accomplish so much more and be part of so much more. Well, how does that happen? Well, first off, I've learned that I can mitigate the challenge of social interaction right away. People do this all the time. But one of the first ones I do, here I am with glasses. And I wear glasses, not just because they may make me look cool, but the reality is my eyes shake back and forth in my sightless eyes, and that puts people off a little. And if I have that on and we start communicating, they realize that the way you communicate with a blind person is the same way you communicate with anyone. You talk, right? You just learn to interact. But if I don't have that there, that moment of discomfort that people are going to face is going to be a problem. By choosing to understand it and educate and take steps, I can work around that. There are many ways I can do that. You know, I've overcome my dread of my cane. Now, I choose to use this beautiful dog guide, Autumn, as a different means, but I use my cane at times. And there's one fun example I like to share. I get on a city bus in Nashua, New Hampshire, where I live, and as I get on the bus, I ask behind the driver, is anyone sitting there? And getting no response, I put my 6'4", 200-pound body surprisingly onto this poor woman's lap. So obviously I apologized, and I asked, I said, did you not hear me? Or maybe did you nod your head? Because I'm not going to hear unless she wears loud earrings. And she said, you know, I heard, I didn't know how to respond. I had a moment of panic because she was trying to evaluate the risk. What are all the things that could go wrong in trying to communicate to a blind person? How do I do it? And while the obvious verbal answer seems clear, I can take steps to make that easier too. For instance, I could have said, excuse me, I can't see it all. If you're sitting there, could you say hello so I'll know you're there and not sit on your lap, right? That works well. Now, the beauty of having my dog guide Autumn with me is she's actually trained to put her head on the chair to show me that it's there. Really wonderful. And there's another power of icebreaker that she brings to our interaction, and that so often people will be like, how beautiful. And I've learned to my dismay that they mean her, not me. But you know what? It's a foothold for a mountain climber like me to start our social interaction. And we all do this in subtle ways all the time. Probably one of the ones you encounter most is somebody saying, you know, hey, we've had an awful lot of snow this winter, or something of that ilk. And what are they doing? Do they really care that much about snow? No, they're trying to find common ground of outreach to see what your response is. If you grumble at them, it could just be that you're sick of shoveling and you're not actually judging them. But it's that fear of rejection, that fear of what could go wrong in this social interaction. And you know, not everybody can have an icebreaker like Autumn. So what I encourage is that we find ways to reach out and connect people, make it safe for them, like my example of explaining my situation so that I could start that. If you can find those ways, what you can do is you can take away the risk of rejection for them as well. Do you put yourself at risk? Absolutely. But what's the risk of isolationism? How much greater is that? Just like my risk of hurting that child because I was worried about reaction to the cane. Well, when you're choosing to connect with people, you have to understand what your choices are. No connection, no future long-term benefit, or make the risk of a little rejection, understand that not every situation is going to be the right one. And you know, one of the tools that works against us in that way is our cell phones. We carry them around these days, and they're all smartphones and do wonderful things. But even in the basic phone, I can't tell you how many times sitting on a bus or at some local place where I might reach out to somebody and I can hear their voice facing me. A voice sounds very different when it's facing you or away. And they say hi. And so I say hello. How are you? Good. How are you? Do you want to go out tonight? I'm like, whoa, that's forward. Oh, no, they're on the phone. Now that's a lost opportunity, obviously, and a little bit to my dismay. And I've sort of learned to try to watch for those signs. But nowadays, people look for the safety of the community that they have with them in their pocket wherever they go. And that's wonderful. Build and preserve your communities. But think about how many lost future communities you have. And the more you restrict that, the more you're restricting your future potential. And that, to me, is the big loss. Right? That, to me, is the opportunity of where we can learn to take those social risks, develop the skills so that we will build and enhance our community and build and enhance our potential going forward. Now, I've often advocated that practice doesn't make perfect, it makes better. And to that end, the more we practice all of this process of risk manipulation, of how we adjust the challenges in our lives, both in meeting people and in the undertakings we want, the better we'll get. And the sooner we can start to see that there really is the light of a brand new day just ahead for us if we're willing to believe. And I don't for a moment suggest there's not going to be points of darkness in your life. I have plenty of them. Right? I have days I get up and, come on, blind again today. And that's okay too, but the point is you have to quickly say, how long do I want to wait before I put my focus to the dawn that's coming? If only I'm willing to have the vision to believe it's there and to look for it. And when I was fully sighted, I did not always have that vision. And that's why my imagining, like yours, may have been, more probably than not, been wrong. And if you get that vision, then there's a great dawn ahead for you in many ways. Thank you for your time.